UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomenon. Are they extraterrestrial, interdimensional, time travelers in origin, or are they simply a result of top-secret military projects, false flag alien invasions, PSYOP, drones, or other human-made aircraft? Join the discussion now on UAP Crossfire.
And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a brand new edition of UAP Crossfire. My name is Don Ecker. I'm going to be leading the show tonight. And as always, we have in the upper left-hand corner, Mr. Christopher DePerno. Right beneath him, we have Commander Cobra. And above me, we have the Padre, Dan Carlson. Gentlemen, it's great to see you all. How y'all doing tonight?
Hi, Don. Everything's good.
Hi, Don.
Excellent, excellent. Now, tonight's show has been kind of a long time coming. We have a very special guest on tonight. It's a gentleman that I have known actually for many years. Years past, I've been on a number of shows with him. Our guest is Mr. Robert Hastings, who is one of the very premier researchers in the United States and possibly around the world on UFOs and nuclear events. You want to bring on Robert? There we go. Robert, hello. Welcome to the show. It's a very distinct pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
Now, let's see how my memory is holding up. In years past, you and I have done several shows where we've been guests. I think one of them, if I remember correctly, may have been the Paracast, going back a number of years. And your father, if my memory serves me, was a career officer. And was that basically what put you on to this research, this groundbreaking research that you've conducted?
My father was career Air Force, but he was a senior master sergeant. In 1967, we were stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, which was then and still is a nuclear missile base. And he worked at a place called the Sage Building, which was basically the NORAD radar facility. He was aware of tracking of unknown targets, maneuvering near the nuclear missile sites out in the surrounding countryside. Improbably, but coincidentally, I was a teenager, and 3 nights a week I worked as a janitor in the base air traffic control tower. And over the course of time, I made the acquaintance of one of the FAA supervisors named Bob Grasser, and I queried him on radar theory and things such as that I was just curious about. And one night I was walking through RAPCON, Radar Approach Control, pushing a broom, emptying trash cans, and he motioned me over to his station, his radar screen, and just said something like, I mean, it's been too many years for me to remember the exact words, but he said basically, we're tracking unknowns, or I don't think he used the word UFOs, but I was pretty sure I knew what he was talking about. And I think I got a little too excited. I sort of peppered him with questions, and his demeanor abruptly changed. He said, why don't you come back later and clean up? So I spent the next 2 hours cleaning the rest of the tower, 3 floors, as I recall, plus the tower with RAPCON in it. And when I passed by his station again and gently brought this up, he clearly didn't want to talk about it. And
I wonder why.
But nevertheless, I went home that night very excited and said to my father, I'm not sure, but I think they might have tracked UFOs at the air traffic control tower tonight. And unbeknownst to me, he did make inquiries, and some number of days later, he confirmed that they were being tracked at the Sage Building as well. They were considered to be bona fide UFOs, and they clearly were maneuvering in the area of one of the flights of 10 missiles southeast of the base.
Was this the time period when that tremendous event happened where apparently one of these unidentifieds came in and shut down an entire flight of missiles? Was
Exactly.
this the time period?
Bob Salas, who is the primary witness who's gone public with that, I actually did the research and found out that occurred on the evening of March 24th, 1967. That coincided during the period that I worked at the tower. He said it occurred in the evening. He couldn't recall what time. I worked somewhere between 6 and 9, and so it's conceivable, not provable, but conceivable that I actually witnessed Bob's incident. I do know from research and other research that's come out that there were multiple UFO incursions at the base's missile sites in the spring of '67. So it may have been another occasion, but it's conceivable that I witnessed Bob Salas's event.
Padre, would you like to pick up there?
As you've been examining this now for decades, I'm wondering if the interactions that have been reported between these objects has any common theme running through them. Is there any special series of events that happens, things that they particularly seem to be interested in?
My book is 500 pages long because this has gone on repeatedly over 6 decades, 7 decades. Even prior to the advent of nuclear missiles, we had nuclear bomber bases, we had plutonium production sites, even in World War II up at Hanford, Washington. And there's a pattern of activity of UFO incursions at anything nuclear in the United States. And the incidents that I've gotten most witnesses referring to, I've interviewed 167 U.S. military personnel. The majority of them are referring to instances in the 1960s and 70s at ICBM bases all around the United States, where mostly the majority of the reports I've gotten, there were mere incursions. These objects were in restricted airspace. A smaller percentage of those reports indicate that missiles were actually shut down when a disc-shaped object, according to security police, hovered over either the missile silos or the launch control facility, which is a central location controlling 10 missiles. A very small, a handful of cases actually involve, according to the retired missile launch officers that I've interviewed. They say their missiles actually went into countdown mode when these objects were reported hovering over missiles. One gentleman in particular named David Schur, who was a captain at Minot Air Force Base in 1966 and 67, refers to just that. He gets reports from his guards topside of a luminous object flying around from missile to missile. They're all widely separated silos out in the countryside. And as that is occurring, he's getting that message on the phone. He's horrified to look down and see that one by one, the missiles on his launch console are going into what's called launch in progress mode, which required him to flip what's called an inhibit switch to actually theoretically prevent the launch of those missiles. And we know from journalist George Knapp, who went to the Soviet Union in the early 90s, he managed to literally smuggle out hundreds of documents that he was provided by a retired Soviet Army colonel. And one of the documents apparently refers to an incident in Soviet Ukraine in October of '82, where an object hovered over one of their missile sites and an unspecified number of missiles went into countdown mode. And while the horrified launch officers down in the launch capsule, they thought we were on the verge of World War III, they didn't know what to do, couldn't do anything. Anything they didn't work. But fortunately, after 15 seconds, the anomaly ceased and everything returned to normal. So that's the kinds of things that are being reported to me by retired Air Force personnel.
Let me just at this point, Robert, let me plug your book. Robert's book is titled UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapons Sites. and that's available, among other places, on Amazon. Where else can the audience look that up, Robert?
It's mainly on Amazon. There are people who buy the book and then resell it at various other sites, but that's the primary source for it.
I couldn't stress enough what an important resource, and actually, quite frankly, along with Barry Greenwood and Larry Fawcett's book that they wrote, this is definitely a must-read for the audience to see what an absolutely real phenomenon this is. Commander Cobra, do you want to pick it up?
Thank you. I will. It's a pleasure to have you, Robert. UFO Hastings.com for the folks that at home that would like to look at the site if they haven't. I can't not echo the words of Don strong enough. I think this is probably one of the most important books I ever read on this subject because of the way you approached it. I have a million questions. I'll try to narrow it down to a couple so that I don't overwhelm. First one is, can you describe your background to the audience that doesn't know you? Obviously, you had this event which started, but your book is very, very well prepared, researched, documented. Just give us a little background.
Let me interject first briefly that I learned in 2018 that Dr. Hal Puthoff, who was the scientific advisor to the ATIP group at the Pentagon that Lou Elizondo headed up, in December of 2008, he gave 4 copies of my book to members of ATIP and other what he referred to as movers and shakers in Washington. And recently, in another podcast, Lou Elizondo said that the book greatly influenced the group. It provided their primary source of information outside of the classified realm on the subject of UFOs and nuclear weapons. So at the risk of sounding like I'm bragging on myself, I waited 40 years to hear that. So it's good to hear it finally. As far as my I was an Air Force brat. I did go to college in 1968 to be an astronomer until I learned I couldn't do math. I failed calculus and I went, what else am I going to do? I ended up training in photography, which I did through the 1970s. I worked for Northern Illinois University as a photographer. But all during that decade, I began to get information through the grapevine about various military persons that were available to me either through my father, acquaintances of my father, or other sources who claimed to have knowledge of these nuclear weapons related UFO incidents. So I informally at first began seeking these individuals out to see what I could learn. By the mid to late 70s, I had what amounted to a research file on these cases. And the more I studied it, the more I felt, this is obviously real. It's widespread. It's terribly important. And why does the government have the right to keep this from the public? So in 1981, I quit my job at Northern Illinois University, went out on the college lecture circuit to try to get the public aware of this situation. And I knew that any given college lecture around the country, there would be media, local media. I sent out press releases left and right and had many people from the media attend all my programs. And so, that was in 81. And between 81 and 2016, I spoke at over 500 colleges and universities. Now, by the late 80s, I realized if that was going to be my sole source of income, lecture fees, I would starve to death. So I retrained in a field called electron microscopy in 1986, electron microscope technology. And that was my bread and butter job. I worked for Philips Semiconductors in Albuquerque. My boss was quite happy with my work ethic and allowed me to get out in the middle of the week and do lectures around the country if I worked weekends. So I did that pretty much until the plant moved to China in 2002. And since that time, I've just been back to doing lectures full time and or writing. I've written 2 books at this point and made a documentary film. So that's how I've passed the time.
Well, I think the work is excellent. One quick follow-up. one of the questions that's always come up is why hasn't the security forces engaged these objects? Why is there hesitation? In some cases, you have documented that it looks like they did engage, and others they haven't. Any thoughts on that?
Well, let's take a handful of cases here. In the instance involving Bob Salas, he's spoken out about this repeatedly now since the mid-90s. And what he has said was when he was down in the launch capsule and got a call about this mysterious object hovering above the launch control facility, which is where the two officers are underground. That's not out at the missile silo. He said the guard was utterly terrified. He said that all the guards were out confronting this thing. They had weapons drawn, apparently, but they were just terrified. And the object didn't stick around that long. He's also referred to a couple of guards being sent out to one of the missile silos away from the facility where he was. And they went out because there were alarms at that missile. And he's reportedly, well, he has said in interviews that sometime later, they reported on the radio they were watching a disc-shaped object at low altitude hovering directly over that missile. They were terrified and came racing back to the launch control facility. If I recall correctly, he said that one of the cops, the security police, was so terrified that he had to be flown back to base by helicopter. He could not function any longer. So that's one example. I'm aware, I haven't personally investigated this, but there's a researcher named Tom Tulane Tulane has investigated cases at Minot Air Force Base in the 60s. And apparently there was an incident where the security police fired upon one of these objects. So I don't know the details as to what occurred next. I don't know if there were, there was pushback from those in the UFO, but there's two responses. But to give you a third one, drawing a blank on the gentleman's name. I'm going to be 75 soon, so I'm having the kind of memory problems that many people in my age group do. But another officer whose name I'm spacing told me about 10 years ago that he was getting radio reports of a UFO hovering, a bright object, cigar-shaped, hovering over his missile sites, moving from missile to missile. And he ordered his security police, as was his job, to go out and investigate. And they kept making excuses. They said, we don't have flashlight batteries. The air pressure in our tires are low and blah, blah, blah. And the next morning, he got the confirmation from what's called the flight security controller, who heads up all the cops. He said, sir, if you promise not to get these guys in trouble, I'll tell you what they told me. They said they were not going to go out to any missile site where that thing was hovering over. And so, there's three different reactions right there.
Right. Thanks.
Well, I got a remark that I'd like to make about that. We have technology primarily for infantry and Marines. We have a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile system that could have been deployed. Now, in a case like this, where there are nuclear weapons that are stored in silos, these incursions are being made. I can't understand why somebody would not have deployed that. Commander Cobra, do you have any ideas or thoughts about that?
When I look at the period that's involved here, I understand the basis of your question, Don. There's no doubt that it's curious to me, and it's always been something that's been very curious. The fear factor or the reaction, which seems to have taken hold for folks, is concerning, and I'm sure that gets reported along. But is there a subtle need here not to engage? Is there a subtle nod, let's just ride this out kind of thing? I don't know. I find it very, very surprising. But I will add one other part to this. I remember here in Maine, up in the northern part of Maine, when we had a base at Loring, where we had B-52s and KC-135 tankers. There was a very strange incursion of some kind of UFO, followed up with strange helicopter activity that was never fully explained. And it was another one of those instances where I was very surprised, given the conditions and the kind of security that SAC of that period presented, that there wasn't at least an exchange or a firing, long rifle and sidearms. Very, very curious to me. So I can't give you a good answer why.
Let me interject.
I think I can give you a good answer on that. I think if I was the guy holding that rocket launcher and if I missed or it didn't hit it, I'm up Schitt's Creek. I mean, I would say that would be the biggest thing. I go, hey, that thing's going 1,000 miles an hour. It's maneuvering like this. It's opening up, activating missiles. What do you think is going to happen with me in this little rocket launcher if I miss? You get one shot with that baby, and I think you're fried.
Go ahead, Robert.
You may be referring to the Loring incidents in October, actually, of 1975.
Correct.
There are declassified documents where on two nights in a row in October of 75, a disc-shaped object was seen by multiple people, according to the documents, as it hovered over what's called the WSA, the Weapons Storage Area, which is the nuclear weapons facility, a storage facility, obviously by its name. This is something that is in my book, but I'm not going to be able to pull up the gentleman's name. But one of my sources said that he was in on what was called a commander's call meeting in reaction or response to those two events, one of the two events. And he was ordered to actually go to an adjacent base. Again, it's mentioned in my book. I can't pull it off the top of my head. And requisition jeeps that had 50 caliber machine guns mounted on them. And he said he was actually on the flight line ready to board the plane to go down to this other base. And that was canceled for some reason. That order to go get those machine guns was canceled. So that was a unique report. I've only received that one kind of report, of something like that going on.
Well, that could mean one of two things to me. Number one, whoever canceled that order perhaps had some type of advanced knowledge, or possibly number two, they were afraid of what the response might be.
Right.
Conceivably, yes.
Are we escalating, or what is that setting up?
Exactly. Chris, do you have anything you want to?
Yeah. First of all, Robert, thank you for being on the show. It's great to actually see you. I've heard so much about you and respect the work that you've done. I'd like to ask you, though, Maelstrom seems to be in a place of a continuing reoccurrence with these UFOs. I actually read that there was an incident as recently as October 2012. Is that correct?
I actually investigated, if we're referring to the same incident. Yeah, okay. That was, I really, because of advancing age and health issues I had, I more or less fizzled out on the research front in 2012. So that was one of the last cases I investigated. But I went to a little town called Roy, which is just spitting distance from the Oscar Flight Launch Control Facility, which coincidentally was where Bob Salas was in 1967. And a number of the townspeople, one in particular, had read my book, invited me up there. I went and talked to several of the townspeople who told me about multiple ongoing UFO activity around Oscar Flight in the 2012 timeframe. And what that involved in particular were two orange-colored boomerang-shaped objects flying in tandem over some of the missiles that Oscar Flight controlled. Again, each flight is composed of 10 missiles. So some of the witnesses told me about other witnesses who had very close encounters with those objects. Unfortunately, those individuals didn't want to go on the record, but apparently that was actually going on as recently as 2012 up at Malmstrom. But again, as I think I mentioned earlier, all of the main ICBM bases have had year after year, decade after decade, this activity is ongoing. People who are interested in this topic to some degree have heard about the Malmstrom cases in '67. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Again, it's been a decade since I've been looking into all of this, but I'm pretty sure it's been going on fairly recently as well.
Now, what you're saying, and this fascinates me, is that different objects have been presented over these bases. Am I correct on that? It's not just a saucer type. You just mentioned a boomerang. Has there been other objects?
The majority of the reports that I've gotten were saucers. Off the top of my head, there were reports of cigar-shaped objects, spheres. There's documents that I'm aware of that describe at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, which was a nuclear missile base. A sphere in broad daylight was seen hovering over one of the missile sites. So there's three separate shapes right there. I think off the top of my head, that report I got in 2012 about these boomerang-shaped objects, that was unique. I can't think of any other instance where I was told that was what the UFO looked like.
And my last question for now, you made a documentary. I can't wait to see it. As I was researching some of the stuff for tonight's show, I noticed that you made a documentary called UFO and Nukes, The Secret Link Revealed. What was the secret link, if you could tell our audience? I can't wait to see this.
The title was simply a reference to the fact that the Pentagon has known that this UFO activity at nuclear weapons sites in general has gone on for decades, and it's been kept secret from the public. So the film basically was a synopsis of some of the more important cases. Therefore, I was revealing that link that the Pentagon will not talk about, and probably the vast majority of the American people have no idea has been going on.
Great. I'm just thrilled that you're here, Robert.
Thank you.
Let me ask you this, Robert. In all the cases that you have researched and investigated, it would seem to me to be a no-brainer that in the event of one of these incursions or a number of incursions, we're talking about a United States Air Force missile facility. Obviously, they've got to be in very close contact with U.S. Air Force fighter jets. Have any flights of fighters been scrambled? And if so, what was the reaction of these bogeys, these unknowns?
One of the documents that was declassified through the FOIA related to incidents at Malmstrom in first week of November of '75. During the same period that stuff was going on at Loring and Wurtsmith Air Force Base in Michigan. And according to they're NORAD logs, logs, let's call them, that describe reports by security police of these incursions, UFO incursions at the missile sites. And it mentions various flights involved. I can't remember off the top of my head, but on one occasion, UFO activity was reported at this one site, one group of missiles, 10 missiles. And it says that 2 jet fighters were launched, F-106s, and the NORAD log states that as the jets approached the position of the UFOs, they extinguished their illumination. They were fully illuminated. Suddenly, as the jets got to their position, they went dark and basically tried to make themselves more difficult to see. It then says that the jets returned to base, and when they did so, the UFOs re-illuminated themselves and continued maneuvering around that particular flight of missiles. But I am, in addition to that one memo, several of my sources, either missile launch officers or missile security police, have said that jet fighters were launched in response to the presence of these objects. And generally what is reported as the jet approaches the area in question, the UFO just puts on a blinding burst of speed and is gone. They don't stick around and extinguish their illumination. They just split altogether.
I was going to ask if for example, those F-106s, when these objects turned off the lights, so to speak, did they also vanish from the jet fighter's weapons radar?
There was no reference into the document, so I really can't, say one way or the other what was going on. Radar is only, feasible above a certain altitude, so conceivably they could have dropped in altitude and made themselves invisible to radar. But in that case, I don't know what occurred in that regard.
Well, in particular, on that 106, that radar wouldn't have been very effective on a target looking down from the altitude that the jet would be at, looking down at the ground. It wasn't designed. More modern fighters have the ability to declutter and on that. But the fact that it's going from the illumination and then reappearing with the illumination is very interesting. But at that time period, it really was not a really effective radar system that would have worked well on a ground target.
I see. I was also thinking of the Sage building back at Malmstrom where my dad was employed. They conceivably, if the objects were high enough in altitude, they could have picked them up as well, just as they did in the case of Bob Salas in 67. I'd like to interject this. I don't know if you were planning to ask me anything like this, but I did another podcast recently, and the person interviewing me said, "Have you ever been threatened at all by the government for the activities I've engaged in?" And in response, what I said was, my first lectures occurred in the fall of 1981. I did 16 dates around basically the Midwest at colleges and universities, got some national publicity through a wire service called United Press International. Now, so I was on, the public's radar to some small degree. At most of those schools, there were veterans in the audience, Air Force veterans, who would come up to me and say, "I know what you're talking about, and I was involved in this, that, or the other." And I said, "Well, I'm going to be on the road for a few weeks. When I get home, can I call you on the phone and interview you?" Some guys said yes, some said no. But in February of '82, I began interviewing these guys. The one I'd interviewed several back in the 1970s, but these were the first that approached me following my advent on the lecture circuit. So in February of '82, I began calling, I think it was 6 or 7 individuals. They would tell me their incident, their experience at whatever base, at whatever time frame, and with their permission, I would record the conversation. I would thank them and say, "I'd like to publish this in a book someday." They all said fine, and hung up. Within 1 minute or 5 minutes, sometimes 10 minutes, I would get another call, and all it was somebody breathing into the phone heavily, not saying any words, and then hanging up. And that occurred after each and every one of these calls to the veterans. Now, I went, okay, I'm obviously on someone's radar. And I was frightened for a while, frankly. I was wondering whether I was going to continue doing this. I didn't know, was I going to be physically assaulted? Would the FBI show up at my door? I mean, I was basically reporting to lecture audiences all over the country classified information about very sensitive incidents. So from the Pentagon's point of view, what I was doing was illegal and certainly not, warranted or sought. And so I thought there was some jeopardy to me. But within a few weeks, I just went, look, either you're going to do this or you're not. And I decided I was going to do it. So I just stuck with it and never looked back.
When did
Well,
the phone stop?
as you know, Robert, my wife and I published UFO magazine for over 20 years. And back in the very early 90s, I broke 2 rather large stories. One of them involved STS-48 and its encounter with an unknown over Australia and New Zealand. Hell, I got that on national television at that time, on NBC and also on CNN. And I thought we would have garnered some type of interest overtly. I'm sure we had it. I'm sure there was covert interest, but I never heard a bloody thing, not one thing officially from any quarter. kind of weird. I always was somewhat surprised by that.
I think it probably comes down to if they lean on people like you and I, if we decide to make a stink and go to the media and, it maybe even can document the encounter in some way, they're creating more publicity, negative publicity for themselves than they think probably is worth it. So I've asked my sources over the years, all the 167 individuals, when I followed up with them at a later date, were you, approached by anyone from the government? Has anyone warned you? And until 2015, every one of them said no. There was an individual named John Mills who gave me some very dramatic information for my book. And I won't go into the details, but even though he had retired, he was seeking an employment in another field. And at a reunion of missileers that he attended, a general who I'm not going to identify, a retired general, sidled up to him and said, you're going to have to pay for talking to Robert Hastings. And I'm not going to get into the details, but they made his professional life difficult, even though he was not in the Air Force anymore. And I was shocked because that had never happened from the mid 70s, early 70s through 2015. I never heard a story like that. But in that one instance, apparently they decided to make an example of him. So there are potential consequences. I don't know if that was a one-off or if future sources who were talk to me or other researchers, whether they can expect the same kind of, approach. Let me briefly add also that I forget, I think this was around 2012 or 13. Another researcher who, again, his name's escaping me. It's sort of a daily occurrence for me these days. He sought confirmation from the government as to whether they had records on me. He got a letter, I've got it, from the FBI confirming that when they checked their index, they had records on Robert Hastings. But they claimed to this individual in this letter that when they went to seek those documents, they were, quote, missing, which I don't believe for a second. But the FBI has acknowledged in writing that they did have records on me. When I myself wrote to the CIA and the National Security Agency, the NSA, what I got from them were what are called GLOMAR letters, and it's basically we can neither confirm nor deny. So those are the responses that I've gotten from the three, big intelligence agencies. They'd be stupid not to keep an eye on me, considering what I've been up to. And the fact that Lou Elizondo now has come out and endorsed my work and said, I was right before anyone else about talking about the nuclear weapons connection. I'm sure they haven't lost sight of what I'm doing.
I'd like to ask you a question about the other branches of the nuclear triad, Robert. You mentioned a lot about the ICBM bases. Did your work also go into any investigations of the naval nuclear assets or Los Alamos or some of our other, maybe not nuclear launch areas, but nuclear facilities that are military oriented?
Some of the sources in my book, certainly the first edition of the book, I think in the second edition as well, were civilian nuclear program workers at Los Alamos or Sandia Labs in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Howard Burgess, for example, who was a Sandia Labs technician for many years, told me in 1984 that he was aware of UFO activity at the labs. He had witnessed it himself. He described a colleague named David Middleton who had gone up to the Nevada test site where they were firing off weapons in the atmosphere in the 1950s. Howard said that he thought this incident occurred in the late 50s, but he couldn't pin it down any sooner, or closer rather. And one day one night at his home, his colleague Dave Middleton unexpectedly paid him a visit at home and said, "You're not going to believe what happened out at the test site." And apparently there was a tower-mounted atomic device that they were about to detonate. And this Dave Middleton was there with a group of Sandia Lab personnel, and there were other Atomic Energy Commission personnel and military personnel. And apparently not long before the scheduled detonation of this device, according to Dave Middleton, two gleaming metallic saucer-shaped objects flew in and flew tight circles around the tower-mounted device before racing away. At which point, apparently, tight circles was the term that was used. And apparently, at that point, the senior AEC, Atomic Energy Commission personnel, postponed the test. Now, Howard said this occurred on a weekend at his home at one night. The next day at work, Howard's in his office. Dave Middleton shows up and is just panicky and said, "Forget everything I told you last night. We were all, sworn to secrecy this morning. We were debriefed and told this is national security. Don't talk to anyone." So Howard told me, again, this was the late 50s. Howard told me he kept that secret until he spoke with me in 1984. As far as the Navy, now this is strange from my viewpoint. I approached retired Navy people who worked on submarines, primarily nuclear submarines, not only nuclear powered, but the boomers, the ones that carry the nuclear missiles. And uniformly, I think I have like two exceptions of all the dozens of naval veterans that I approached, told them who I was, gave them verification of my research efforts, gave them sources in the Air Force I had talked to that they could corroborate that I wasn't, a government agent or just some crazy person interested in UFOs. With a couple of exceptions, every naval veteran that I spoke to said, "I am not going to talk to you about that. Leave me alone." Now, why all of these Air Force guys didn't respond that way? Some did, certainly, but they were in a minority over the years. But almost all the naval veterans did. They didn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. Why, I don't know.
I can't hazard a quick guess, Robert. I don't think it has anything to do with you, but the silent service really takes not talking to probably the highest level. That is a kind of a characteristic that is in their DNA after they get into the submarine forces. That the other part is this: everything I've ever heard about UFO, UAP with submarines has never been from the submarine. Meaning, when they're underway, they don't have very good sky view, but every record I've read where it's been reported was remote viewing that would talk about this when they were trying to ask remote viewers, where do you think the submarine is and what do you see? And when they would draw the picture, showing a disc or sometimes the cigar shape. But it doesn't surprise me that community was somewhat A, curious to hear what you had to say, but B, not going to comment and so to speak, play along at all.
I will say I'm thinking of two people in particular. The guys who were the exceptions to the rule and did talk to me were sonar operators, and they told me each independently that they picked up underwater targets approaching their subs that were traveling faster and engaging in maneuvers that no American or Russian, as far as they knew, submarine could match. So those were the very limited reports that I got.
And I'm glad you said that, because one thing that's never been clear, with the remote viewer, when they would draw this submarine and then what they saw, if that disc or that cigar shape that was near the sub was just in water above the sub. That's never been discussed. I think the assumption always was, it's in the air over the sub. So it's interesting. I think the sonar actually adds a great deal of validity because that's really the eyes of the submarine.
My opinion is, it's clear there's enough sources on the record now to indicate that they and the UFOs are willing to tamper with our terrestrial weapons,
Sure.
the missiles and the bombers bases. It's only logical. It's entirely predictable that they would be playing games with the Navy's missiles, but I've never seen never gotten a report about actual tampering with the missiles, just the close proximity appearance of these objects near the boomers.
Well, we have a friend and associate who is an astronomer. You may know him, Mark D'Antonio.
Yes.
And a number of years ago, Mark was doing some contract work for the Navy. and he was on board a nuclear submarine. They were out at sea. I have no idea what he was doing there, but he was in the sonar room when the sonar operator picked up something that basically is what you're talking about. A UFO that was submersible was in the ocean, but it was traveling at phenomenal speed, at least 100+ kilometers per hour through the water. And when the sonar man reported it to his officer that was in charge, he said, well, just mark it down and then forget about it.
I've read the report. It's quite intriguing. Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, these stories have actually been cropping up more and more of recent time. These USOs,
Right.
unidentified submersible objects.
Right.
Hell, right down here off of Malibu, there's an area that is believed to be, believe it or not, an underwater UFO base.
Right.
It's wild. Now, what the military, if anybody has been doing about it, I have no idea. But they have to know about it. I'm sure they do.
Right.
Robert, I have a question for you. On this show, we've debated this issue often about disclosure. And what is your think about the way disclosure is starting to go now, if we'll ever get disclosure? Or do you think the government will just keep leading us on as they've been doing?
It has to come sooner or later. I hope it's sooner. I tried not to get my hopes up, but there have been some pretty dramatic developments over the last few years. People like Lou coming forward, David Grush coming forward, other individuals. So there seem to be some cracks in the dam that are developing. On the other hand, I'm also in touch with some retired, in particular, one high-level retired CIA officer. I won't identify him, who said, the powers that be, the people that I worked with all these years, they're not going away. They're pushing back. They're not going to walk away from this. They don't think this should be made public. And so any efforts that are being made currently should expect some pushback, some resistance from the people who've covered this up since the 1940s.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'll just add that President Trump, whatever your opinion of him, he does seem to be a wild card in some respects. Some of the people that he's put in positions in his administration have already gone on the record in terms of saying UFOs are real, we don't know what they are, and so on and so forth. So it's conceivable that maybe something from the actual administration will break things, but that remains to be seen.
Have you seen anything from this new release of this whistleblower, Jake Barber, and the egg shape from a helicopter that people have been just recently talking about?
I watched the interview. In my opinion, he's credible. And I've just within the last week or since the interview, I've texted both Lou Elizondo and Dave Grush to ask them, is this guy legitimate? And both of them said absolutely legitimate. So I don't know if I'm breaking news here, but that's their opinion, and I'm sure they'll corroborate that.
Yeah, well, there's been strong debate on whether he is credible or not. So I thank you for bringing that in.
Okay.
Robert, in all of your time, now are you basically now, you've pretty much divorced yourself from the topic because of, various personal reasons, or do you still keep your hand in a little bit?
I'm paying attention, but I'm basically a spectator at this point. The kind of research I did for 50 years involves a lot of beating the bushes and contacting people. And weeding out, legitimate sources from tall tale tellers and all of that. That's a lot of work. It's very time consuming. And I just don't have the energy or the mental focus anymore. As regards research, I'm more or less very curious, still obviously very interested in anyone who comes forward with credentials who talks about this publicly, the nuclear weapons angle, but I don't do any research. We could get into the other side of the story, and maybe all of you or some of you don't know the rest of the story. But I'm an experiencer, and I kept that secret for decades because I knew that it would negatively impact my credibility in terms of being a credible source for military-related UFO information. But in 1988, August 13th, I went on a camping trip near Albuquerque with about 15 people. And without getting into the details, by 48 hours later, based on what I recall and what other witnesses, other campers reported, there was a close proximity UFO sighting. This object landed on the ground within the campsite. And I subsequently, after 4 years of procrastination, got involved with a very skeptical psychiatrist named Dr. Sandy Sylvester and engaged in time regression hypnosis to try to retrieve the memories of that evening. Now, that technique is very controversial, but there are psychiatrists and psychologists who do say that it's a legitimate research technique if it's properly employed. And what came out over 6 one-hour sessions over a 6-week period convinced me beyond any doubt that I and 2 other individuals were in fact taken out of our tents and taken aboard this landed craft. And I've subsequently had other experiences very similar to that. As probably most of you know, people who report ongoing UFO face-to-face encounters with these entities, it's not a one-off usually. It's usually multiple occasions over time. And all through the late 80s, all through the 90s, and up to as recently as 2014, I had what I can't think of anything else that would account for what I've experienced and what I recall, not even with hypnosis, just, memories that I've been able to maintain that would lead me to believe it was anything other than an abduction. I'm in my bedroom right now. Behind me, you'll see a closet door and my bed. The other way, I'm going backwards here, but in that corner between the closet there and the window on the right side of the screen, on December 31st of 2014, I awoke out of sleep. My head came up off the pillow. There was a gray entity standing at the foot of my bed, right behind where we're talking. And I was about to scream, and before I could, I was clearly rendered unconscious because what seemed like the next instant, bright sunlight was flooding in the windows. And, it was morning, several hours had passed. Now, in the course of my conversations with Bob Jacobs, and maybe we can get into his case, the Big Sur UFO case. In the course of my conversations with Bob Jacobs, I'm the one that really brought the Big Sur case to the public's attention back in the 80s. I began lecturing about it after I received documents from him and interviewed him. And basically, cutting to the chase, that was a shoot down of a dummy nuclear warhead in September of '64 by a disc-shaped object that was filmed. The whole encounter was filmed. And I'll say briefly, Lou Elizondo has just publicly confirmed that he saw the Big Sur film while he was with ATIP. And it shows exactly what Bob Jacobs, Lieutenant Jacobs, has been saying since the 80s publicly. Now, where I was going with this is in 2012, Bob and I, he allowed me to film several veterans in his studio at Bradley University. They are interviewed for my film, the film that was previously mentioned. And as I was leaving for the day, I went into his office and closed the door and said, Bob, we've known each other for more than 20 years. I need to tell you something that I've kept private. And I told him that I had had these, quote, abduction experiences, not knowing how he would react. And cutting to the chase, he, much to my shock, said, I've had them too. And, after I got over being stunned, We compared notes, and over time we compared notes. Well, Bob's 86, and in 2017, I was diagnosed with this heart condition and told that my future was uncertain. So he and I just went, look, we've spent decades trying to get the facts out to the public. You and I know that some of those facts involve these abduction experiences that we've had. If we're not going to be hypocrites, if we're going to leave this planet with that secret, I don't want to do that. I want to go public with it. And he said, I feel exactly the same way. So we wrote a book called Confession, and it's available at Amazon. But what it basically describes as best as possible are the encounters that he and I have had. And again, I understand that some people may have listened to the first part of this interview and went, wow, this guy really seems to know what he's talking about. He seems credible. But as soon as I mentioned this latest information, I've lost part of your audience for good because of their own biases, their own ignorance, their own unfamiliarity with the topic. But I'll tell you that the abduction encounters are physically real. They're every bit as real as the missile site encounters. And at some point, if enough people come forward, I've got 7 veterans I've interviewed out of 167 who said, I've had abduction experiences. So, deal with it, people. Those of you who just can't wrap your heads around this, educate yourself, try to learn the facts before you say this can't possibly be true and Hastings full of crap. It's real. And believe me, I've sacrificed a lot in terms of credibility in some quarters by being candid about this. But again, I don't want to leave the planet whenever that may be without, being honest, being candid with people about this.
Well, as they say, Robert, to thine own self be true.
That's
Look,
right.
We are at the top of the hour. I know that you've got to leave now, but let me just say that this has been a distinct pleasure. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Please keep in touch, and perhaps down the road a little bit, we can revisit this.
I'm happy to do that. And again, to let the audience in on this, I asked you to keep this to an hour because one of my symptoms is breathlessness. And as I've been talking, I can feel it coming on. And so, let's, cut things here while I'm still able to talk reasonably well.
Very good. Well, thank you, Robert. And ladies and gentlemen, when we come back, we will be taking a look at the tragic events that happened in the skies above Washington, D.C. last evening. Stick around. We'll be back.
Hey members, the new KGRAdb app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRAdb programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRAdb.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, You are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at KGRAdb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected, only at KGRAdb.com.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. And just as the show was starting to happen earlier this evening, we were all here waiting to go on the air. And I mentioned to Commander Cobra that Robert is only going to be on for 1 hour. And when we come back, what do you think about discussing the events of last night? And he told me, and I quote, "That's all I've talked about today." So with that being said, Commander Cobra, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I'm going to run a couple things on you, Don. I'd like to be able, if we could, also shift over to the POTUS's announcement on the New Jersey UAP drone situation as well. I'd like to spend a little time with that. First and foremost, God's peace that surpasses all understanding and knowledge in this situation. This is one of the most heartbreaking things that I've seen. I've had so many people contact me since last night, this morning. I was up approximately 4 a.m. Mrs. Cobra had actually heard about, because I was in bed early to get up for work. Today's a base day. And she called me as soon as I got to the office when she got up a couple hours later just to check in. And I learned about this driving into work on the radio. And then very shortly, right after 6 a.m., my first text came to me from some folks that wanted to know. Obviously, with my coworkers, many of them thought, were asking my opinion. I'm one of the few pilots that actually works on this project that we're on. So I immersed myself as quickly as I possibly could. I would direct everyone that's listening, if you're interested, to go to the War Zone, TWZ.com, the War Zone. They have the best series of articles and information there. I have consistently tried to bring their reporters onto the show. They are phenomenal on all these subjects, and it's probably the best site. So with that said, my sincerest prayers and sympathy to everyone that's involved in this, because this is just an absolutely horrible, horrible situation. So with all that said, I will cut right to the chase what I think has happened based on what I know. I'm familiar with the area. I'm very familiar with the area. I'm very familiar with that particular piece of water on the helicopter route. I spent almost as much time flying light fixed-wing airplanes in that particular part of the world. The CIFR, as it's referred to around D.C., is some of the most closely monitored, controlled, and active airspace in the world. You cannot get within 20 miles of DC without proper designation, or you're going to be met by a Air Force F-16. And if you're a slow mover and a low mover, you're going to be met by a Coast Guard helicopter that is stationed on a rotating basis at Reagan International Airport, or Reagan National. So what do I think happened? I think on a proper standard training flight, although there's some interesting deviations that are being reported to the flight path of the Black Hawk helicopter, which is a Army unit that has a particular mission to support moving, for the lack of a better term, VIPs or distinguished travelers in the DC area. That's kind of a day mission. The combat mission is the ability to move people around Pentagon, national security agencies in a case of an emergency. It's called continuation of operations. The Air Force does it as well. They handle quite a bit of the congressional people, as well as Air Force and senior staff officers like the Army, and the Marines, of course, with the helicopter take the president, and then, of course, the Air Force with Air Force One. So if there's an emergency, these aircraft are used to move critical leadership to safety or to operating locations that are secure. So there's a lot of practice on this mission. There's a lot of constant maintaining and proficiency that's being flown. So it seems that that's what the mission was for the Black Hawk helicopter. What I think happened, listening to and intently listening to and reading the transcripts, when they identified where they were and where they were flying, the control tower asked them to, with their clearance, to keep sight with an aircraft. The tower was indicating the aircraft they collided with, and it appears to me, just based on what I've done on the analysis, and it's also as a former safety officer in the military, flight safety officer, that they identified the wrong aircraft. When they acknowledged the aircraft they were looking at, they thought they were clear, and then as the CRJ was coming in to make the landing, they were in a most likely in a turn and then leveling out, so they would have been kind of putting their belly towards the helicopter type situation, if I'm understanding the geometry correctly, and that contributed to it. So you have the helicopter. The other thing that's very unusual that's going on is the helicopter is making a very rapid descent at the point where they collide. And was there something as a malfunction on the helicopter? We may learn that on the recovery of the wreck of the helicopter. Unfortunately, we do not carry a lot of voice recorders or black boxes on these aircraft. That's not uncommon. They just do not show up on this size of helicopters and aircraft very often. Did they see it? And most helicopter pilots will probably look to go low and try to get away. That's kind of a natural tendency that you would have, because helicopters fly close to the ground, and it's usually faster to go down than it is to try to climb and get away. It's at night. That's a huge contributor to depth perception, closing. I imagine that's some of the factors. But it is a best guess from Commander Cobra what had happened. There are plenty of conjecture. I really don't want to go deeply into conjecture. I don't want to talk about DEI influences on this. I don't want to talk about all the other possible factors. They're all there. People can talk about it. It's somewhat superfluous to the discussion.
Well, two questions. Two questions. Number one, I heard today that the Black Hawk was flying with night vision rules. In other words, the pilot, co-pilot were using night vision goggles,
and most likely the crew member in the back as well.
Okay, now would that?
So it's not unusual. In fact, hardly anyone in the military at night in a helicopter flies unaided. It's very unusual. Generally, night vision goggles are now the way to go. They are the most, they provide the absolute best visibility in the dark, better than the naked eye. They do have issues that come up when you are around large light sources where they will cause a certain amount of glaring, but the technology now with the NVGs is excellent. Often what will happen, though, is you will wear your goggles so that the goggles are up a little bit so that you look underneath the goggles. You look underneath the goggles now, the size that they are, so that you can see your instrument panel, to see your displays in the aircraft while you're flying. And a lot of times you will do head movement where you can look underneath. It's not uncommon. That's a fairly standard part. In fact, I would think that the NVGs would have helped sighting the aircraft sooner because the light, as we were explaining on our show the other night, when we were talking about the egg being slung low and what would happen, what we were seeing in that picture,
Right.
the light source would have showed up very, very quickly and brightly. But not a lot of experience in Blackhawks. The X-49 that I test flew was a Navy Seahawk, basically same aircraft. Once you identify where you're at, when you believe you have the proper assigned target for your clearance, and there wasn't another assigned target, when you travel into airspace, the tower or the controller says to you, "You're cleared visual. Call the aircraft at 12 o'clock, 6 miles, landing or taking off from the airport." And you call tally or contact with that target. Contact would be the correct term. Tally is more of a tactical situation. You call contact with that. I am visual. And now you are responsible in the helicopter and in the airplane. Generally, it goes both ways. The helicopter would be pointed out to the aircraft that is landing as well. So the NVGs you look, I think, in this case, is most likely not a contributing factor to it. I think that they looked, they saw it, they saw that they had clearance, and they were continuing maneuver. Now, do we have a problem that's developed in the helicopter at this point that's causing them to do a descent? Or that's all conjecture. And it's going to be very difficult given the situation to probably put it together. They might be able to get some indications if they find something on the wreckage to figure that out.
Well, here's something that I believe you are uniquely qualified to discuss. Earlier today, I heard a report that the control tower was running short of personnel.
Right.
19 individuals in the control tower. Normally, they would have had, if they were fully staffed, 30 people in there.
Correct.
30 operators. Now, the question, Commander, do you think that could have had any type of effect on the events that happened?
Yes. So you're going to read quite a few reports where they're talking about controller fatigue. They're working 6 days a week. There is another report that usually there's 2 people on duty. There was only 1 present at this particular time when it occurred. Those are all contributing factors. 2-person backup allows for, cross-check between the 2. There could be an experience factor. All those things have to be looked at. So yes, it's probably. Why did that occur? Without going into the social parts of it, our air traffic control system has been under pressure for decades. We have had some wonderful reprieves, but we have been fighting a losing battle in many, many instances. We got a little breather during COVID when there was less flying activity, and that definitely has ended with the huge surge of people getting back into flight. And what I meant by we've had some reprieves, when we switched over to GPS navigation systems almost universally in every aircraft, the smallest airplane to a large airliner uses GPS. We have added a number of devices to the majority of the air fleet. Not all military aircraft carry it. And in this particular case, even further, a lot of these aircraft on this particular mission I was describing would not use enhanced transponder capability. I'll explain why in a second. So you have had the ability to work aircraft physically closer to each other in flight because there are multiple systems where the aircraft will talk to each other and give a warning to the pilots in each aircraft, if they're so equipped, that you are approaching a target. In the early 90s, I was part of a system that we brought into Navy trainers. I absolutely lambasted it the first time I flew it because it did not work. And I almost had a midair. And I still remember that it's like it was yesterday when it happened. It was very close. and I wrote it up, and there was a lot of people very upset because, there was a lot of unhappiness that wasn't performing. And the job was, we were flying, it was supposed to tell us, it didn't. They continued to work on software. They continued to work on the antenna arrangement. And later I had another encounter, and it was significantly the reason that it saved my life, the second close emitter. That's not uncommon in the training world because of the density of training activity. And you have designated areas, and you have lots of airplanes, and you make radio calls. We weren't under strong radar control. We had basically visual separation. The reason that the Black Hawk helicopter was not operating with advanced systems, two reasons. If they were on a mission training profile, because of the sensitivity of the people they're carrying and the world of things like FlightAware and the other online services that you can track aircraft, one of the ways they are able to track the aircraft is when it goes into the system with, they call a transponder, and other advanced things like with a thing called ADS-B out. Those devices give information to the aircraft. And it's on the screen. So if you are flying sensitive missions and you're moving sensitive people around, you do not normally want that to be available to the public, because if it's available to the public, an enemy source could track who's being moved or know where the helicopter is going, know where sites are that may be sensitive to where they land for secure facilities, protected sites, things like that. So if they were on a training mission and they were doing that, they're flying on designated routes. It's a visual route. They're doing the normal radio calls, and they would not emanate. This is not uncommon work. During the last years of the Cold War, when I started flying in the military, there were 2 to 4 hour missions where we never made a radio call. We did not have any emitting devices, and we flew no GPS in those days. We flew on charts or heading in altitude and speed to perform our mission, because we did not want to send a signal out that could be used to use direction finding and give our position away, or give position of the ship away that we had launched from. So hopefully that gives you some of the understanding that's going on. Back to the tower. Yep, it appears that they are undermanned. It's not an uncommon situation. And if this had gone with a very close pass and it made the news that, an Army helicopter flew very close and caused the airliner to have to do a divert, as you have heard numerous times where airplanes have gone to the wrong runway, airplanes have made the approach to the wrong runway. It's happened a lot. This is part of the ongoing situation that we have. And the airspace is demanding, and we have we do not have updated equipment for air traffic control for the National Airspace System, and we have a lack of controllers.
Chris?
Commander, if I could ask you, first of all, I know very, very little about helicopters and planes and everything. So, I'm taking this as a learning lesson from you. But I'm wondering, I see this on the movies that planes have a sophisticated radar. I'm talking about the actual jet now, not the helicopter. That, like you said, gives a voice inside, says warning, warning, collision, collision, however it says. Now, if they have such a radar, wouldn't have that gone off at a safe distance where they could have reacted?
First, Chris, no, it's not radar.
Okay.
The radar on most airplanes is designed for weather. It doesn't detect other airplanes. And the reason you want that radar is so that when you're making an approach from high altitude, which is the most efficient place for an airliner type airplane to fly, 25,000 feet or higher, when you're starting to make the approach, you do not want to fly into a thunderstorm or a hard cell that can rip an airplane apart. We've learned that the hard way in the late 40s and 50s. So radar is generally for weather. Yes, you can get some ground mapping capabilities out of it, but in general, most radars on helicopters, most radars on airplanes, especially civil airliners. Fighter airplane have the radar for detecting targets or mapping the ground. That's the difference. So no, this situation was not a radar situation. What you're asking about is because of the density around airports, what we call the terminal airspace activities, we have added more gear on board that does two things. When you have the ground radar from air traffic control paint your aircraft with that radar, it activates a piece of gear on an airplane or a helicopter, any aircraft that's so equipped, called a transponder. And when that transponder is activated, it instantly sends a signal out that gives a lot of information. It says what the airplane is or the aircraft is, its registration number or its call sign. It'll have its altitude, it'll have its airspeed, and it'll also indicate if it's climbing or descending or if it's level, and the speed by which it is traveling. I may have repeated myself there. In this particular case, the ground radar was painting both, but the helicopter appears not to have had its transponder on because of that mission situation that I was explaining. They may have been flying a profile of the mission. Again, conjecture on my part, just what I've been able to glean from what I've been reading today. So the other piece of gear that's been added is in tandem with that transponder is a transmitter receiver that goes out in the range using that radar impulse to tell other aircraft and calculating returns that it is receiving, telling you you're getting close to another aircraft. And of course, the idea is to tell you in enough time ahead of time so that you can look in that location and move. It also works when you're in the weather. It can give you a signal to tell that you have, and it'll give you a direction above, below, or on level with you, and you have a convening two aircraft at the same altitude. So in this case, the reason you heard that is that the detection on the airliner, I believe, is what we were hearing when you hear that alarm go off, because we didn't hear anything from the helicopter. It is detecting using that gear, using the radar return that's coming from the ground air traffic control, the ground-based radar. It's calculating and it realizes that it has a target moving at it and on a combining flight path, and that's why the alarm goes off.
Now, wouldn't the air traffic controllers see that they were on a collision course? I mean, I'm only going by what I've seen in the movie.
What happens is that in the tower, they're not using radar at this point. They are in a terminal activity, and everyone is visual, meaning the prevailing rule that's going on. It was a clear night last night in DC. You are flying on visual rules. So when the airliner checked in and they could see, and they had come off their radar, and they are now talking to the control tower, they check in with the control tower. They're told what runway they're going to, the position. They do have a radar repeater in the tower, but they're looking outside and at there, but they're not radar controllers at that point. They're visually controlling.
Okay.
So they give that clearance. When they talk to the helicopter, they tell the helicopter, you have a visual target, call that visual target in sight and maneuver clear of that target. That's what the call that they receive is. The helicopter crew acknowledges that. They called the target in sight. This is where I think they called the wrong aircraft in sight because there was multiple aircraft around. They did not see the aircraft they collided with, and that's what happened. So they're not monitoring on radar because in the terminal area, unless it's under instrument conditions. If it was under instrument conditions, the helicopter wouldn't have been there because it would not have been able to be flying on a visual route that they fly all over the river. If that makes sense. So there isn't radar separating them at that point in the conditions they were flying.
So if it transpired as you theorized, Commander, that's a pilot error, isn't it?
Well, it could be pilot error as well as it could be controller error. Yes, definitely it's going to be the human factor error on this. So again, a lot of people have made the part out where they talk on two different frequencies, two different radios. So for the helicopters, they're talking on a different frequency than the airliner was to the same tower. That's not all that unusual that you have dual frequencies. When they hit the transmit button in the tower, both radios, both frequencies are activated. The control tower is the agency that's doing that. So the control tower believes, I think they probably, just based on what I've read and heard so far, they probably needed to have a slightly more precise confirmation that they had the right target. Normally you would hear the traffic is landing to runway 33. The aircraft is landing to runway 01, or an aircraft is taking off from runway 01. That would help you know where to look, because it's obvious they know where the airfield is. They know if the aircraft is approaching or departing the airfield. Also, that helps you figure out altitudes. You don't want to get low towards the approach end of the runway where that aircraft could be coming from. So that probably means it's going to be a combination of errors. The third contributing factor, if there was a problem on the helicopter, if they had, they had some kind of an immediate emergency come up and they're trying to deal with that, they may have missed a call. They may have not heard anything else. I didn't hear any other calls, but I don't have complete access to all the information that's being compiled. But I think it's going to be a combination of those factors.
Let me ask you this. Do you think they'll be able to determine certain things by getting the wreckage? I mean, with the helicopter? How would they go about that? I mean,
well, you bring a barge up, and the barge is going to crane up after they go through the recovery of personnel. And then they'll pick up every piece of gear. There's divers in the water that will recover it. They'll also mark as much as possible, which is very difficult because this time of year, the river is running quite high because of all the rain and snow and it's going down. So they have a pretty harsh current that they're working against. So the reason that you kind of mark positions, and again, it's made easier with GPS using that, they know from the radar plot where the collision occurred, then they can know where it landed. If you know what the current was, you can figure out a lot. And that tells you a lot of information. Then you physically have to try to reassemble as much of the aircraft as you possibly can, usually in a hangar facility, where they'll go through and then they'll start inspecting. Not this case. Other cases I've been involved in. The pilot was flying the aircraft. He entered into an aerobatic maneuver, and the wing came off the airplane. He tried to eject. He couldn't get out of the airplane because the revolution was so high because of the speed and when it was on, and he perished. At first glance, it looks like, well, maybe he over-G'd the airplane, and that's what caused the wing to depart. What it turned out to be was he did the maneuver correctly, because there was not a reading when they looked at all the gear, when they physically looked at it, but they found out over the years, metal fatigue had set in, probably from too many over-Gs, not doing enough inspection, and the wing just came off in that maneuver when the G load came up to a normal G load. You determine that by physically checking the metal. There's countless facts that come out. It's actually quite amazing if you can separate from the absolute tragedy of the loss. The forensics that goes on in this, the engineering forensics especially, is amazing. That goes on. Why do we do that? Well, it's so that you can figure out if there's a problem with the fleet of aircraft, if there's something we have to change in the inspection, if there's something we have to do. In this case, they'll get as much of those aircraft up. They will examine everything. One of the things they're going to look at, obviously, very, very quickly, as much as possible, is, did the helicopter have any signs of a malfunction that was going on? Will they find something that has gone wrong? Obviously, it would be much better if you had a data recorder or a voice recorder so that you could hear what they were saying on intercom to each other, not on the radio, but on the intercom, so that you can find out. We've learned a lot from that. And that may be a finding that comes out that says we really need to put this on all the aircraft. One of the reasons you don't like to have it on military airplanes is, aside from the fact they were never designed to carry it, if the aircraft went down in a combat situation, the enemy could get information by listening to what is there, getting data out of it. I'm not quite sure that that's as strong an argument as it probably once was. I think it's mainly a situation where you just don't think about it. It's something. Newer aircraft do have data recorders. It's just part of the system because they're much more computerized. The 60, as wonderful an aircraft is, and it is one hell of a great helicopter. There's no doubt about it. All its versions are amazing, and it's a good aircraft. Just does not incorporate as much. They'll get some data. There's some data recorded on the aircraft. They should be able to recover some of that. That will show what the engines were. That will show what was happening. And they usually take that data. They put it into a computer program that will show the flight and what's going on. Then you mesh that information with other sources.
There was talk that airport should have been shut down. They said that it has a short runway. It's actually dangerous. Is that correct?
Well, I'm going to give you an opinion. It is I don't know if you've ever flown into Reagan, but if you are on the visual approach into there, it is a very aggressive approach. You do have to usually make turns. There's sensitive airspace around it, obviously. And it is a somewhat short runway. It doesn't have a lot of overrun. I've heard this for years, probably because of the kinds of clients that you have and having it right there in DC. It really does. It's really hard to shut it down. They've put a lot of improvements over the years to it. The airfield is in demand because of Congress. It's in demand for people that want access to DC. And Dulles, which is further out, is more of the international airport, where this was the national airport. So yes, that has been a repeated claim over the years. I think there is some validity to it. There may be a restriction now or a change in flow and traffic, but it's a very busy field and it's a very demanding field. If I'm not, I am 99% sure that you have to be not specially trained, but you have to be checked out to fly into that field. If you're not checked out to fly, and there's some airfields that are like that around the world, where they're so demanding that the airlines require an extra training notch in your capabilities to go in there. So you wouldn't send a pilot in there that had not been checked out by another pilot that is familiar with that field and make sure that they can handle it. So I think that is an issue. I think that'll probably come up. And it's unfortunate, but I think that may be something they have to look at again.
My prayers go out to every one of those families that lost a loved one in this horrible, horrible incident.
Yeah.
Well, should we talk about UAPs for a while?
I wouldn't mind. I got to tell you, this is a tough one.
Well, you had mentioned drones too.
Yeah, right. So I wanted to throw one last piece in there. You'll hear the call sign in a couple of the recordings where I think they're calling for Blackjack 03 to return to the field. And that is added to a little bit of the confusion. Black Hawk helicopter, United States Army. Blackjack should be the call sign for the Coast Guard helicopter, which is stationed on a rotating basis for another Coast Guard station to perform the air intercept mission out of Reagan for the CIFR around DC, the security airspace around DC. For fast movers, they fly an F-16, which launches from a base outside of the area, and then for slower moving targets. Just the other day, in fact, I think I sent you guys the article. There was a very good description, again from the war zone, describing the Blackjack helicopter being launched and an F-16 being launched for a drone in the DC airspace that was reported. And they both went looking for it. They got to the location and they couldn't find it. But in the recording last night during this mishap, you will hear the controller and the tower tell Blackjack 03 to return and land at the airfield immediately now because of the mishap. That added to a lot of confusion because when I first was hearing the reports, they thought the call sign for the The helicopter, the Army helicopter, was Blackjack. And it appears that is not the call sign it was operating under. That was the Coast Guard aircraft. It was not involved in the mishap. In fact, they probably were part of the search immediately afterwards. I'm sure they had to launch for that as they brought surface vessels in to start the recovery and put divers in.
Okay, how about some happy news? I'd like to welcome some new listeners tonight. I'm trying something new here, guys. We are live streaming on my meteorology weather page on Facebook, about 4,000 people who are followers of that. So you're going out to people who are interested in things in the sky weather-wise, and it looks like we got a pretty good audience tonight. So welcome to Dan's weather page, all of you who are watching us there tonight.
Have you explained to your followers there about the Padre call sign? Do they understand all that? I'm sure they do.
They'll pick it up. I mean, they know I'm a pastor, so they.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah,
well, welcome to that august group. While we're throwing out names, I want to identify Jack, superfan, who has been engaging with me by email, and Don. He was listening to us on Monday as well, and he was sending me a lot of data. I just couldn't keep up between the different pages that I was going through, plus the flurry of questions that you and Jagari were tossing at me nonstop.
Multitasker that you are.
Yes, multitasker that I am. With my Commodore 64 helicopter, 64 Commodore computer that I use up here in Maine, feeding the squirrel sugar cubes and carrots to keep the generator going.
The press secretary for Donald Trump had her first press conference, and she dealt with the drones over New Jersey. Nothing to see here, everybody. Everything was approved by the FAA. They were doing research and some other things. Now, a couple things about that announcement piqued my interest. First of all, and Commander, you can speak to this. You're the aviator of the group. I'm under the impression that pretty much everything that flies in the airspace has to be in one way or another approved by the FAA. And then I want to know what those other things were that they're doing. They're doing research and other things. What do you think?
I think it's an amazing announcement, and on a lot of fronts. First, I'm very happy that the president kept his word and they released that. That's number one. Obviously, the very first question or the very first comment that I would make on that before I answer your questions and the points you raise is, okay, so why didn't you just tell us that a couple months ago when this was all going on? Now, we know from the 60s that the government engaged in disinformation to UFO enthusiasts, showing up at conventions, putting people into those conventions, telling them about secret deals that were made with aliens. It's all there. It's all documented. There was active operations to monitor the enthusiasts of UFO activity and to throw them off. One of the most famous cases was the use of the stage prop for the day the Earth stood still. And that wasn't the government that did that. There was a group of people that showed up, and they were getting investors, and they would take them out to a hangar and they would show them the flying saucer. And if they invested money, they were going to be, because they had made contact, they had people that acted like the aliens. It's a documented case. Okay. So were we playing the game that we were looking for something to maybe throw the election that was coming up, because this preceded the election by about 30 to 45 days when it really started to get to fever pitch? Was this some kind of vector there? I think that there's a pretty good case for that you're taking something that's approved and you're turning into it. Also, I'd like to point out, back at that time, there was a couple folks that came on and said it's absolutely not tracking nuclear material. It's absolutely not tracking terrorist or terrorist cells. There's no way it's going. And there was one of the gentlemen that was there. I'm a military pilot. I've talked to people involved. And then he added at the end of it, but it's scaring the hell out of me. And he never said what was scaring the hell out of him, but he absolutely made it positive. There's no way that it's involved with terrorists. It's not involved with tracking nukes. So that one really bothered me. It bothered me at the time when that individual came up and said that, because you supposedly talked to people that were involved. They explained to you, but it scared you. So what I think was probably going on, Padre, is that they may have been experimenting for this delivery by drones or UAS systems for things like Amazon and others to do these deliveries. There's that's a fairly busy corridor. If you're going to, for airspace, if you're going to do that, you may want to set up activities so that you can monitor how it happens, how you can do that. There are, on my aeronautical charts, there are areas you can't fly. There's temporary ones that are set up. They're usually referred to as TFRs. You just know certain areas you cannot fly anything in. And now this particular part of the country is really ripe for this kind of aerial delivery support because of the density of the population, the road structure, it's got a lot of traffic. So this is a really good way to move material around, even if it's in small amounts. Okay, so I'll play along with that and say, okay, that may work. Again, I'll go back to it. Why didn't we just come out and say this? Was this something that we were conveniently trying to use to raise a fever pitch? You had a congressman, I believe a representative, a House member, who was talking about the Iranian mothership off the coast flying these. And, he's, again, were we trying to promote concern, worry, distraction going forward on this? I don't know, but it sure stinks to me on that.
If I can add a little bit, Padre, to this, I did a little research on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the thing called NEST, the National Emergency Support Team, which has to go out on any radioactivity type of incident. They go out, and they found out that one of the ones that they actually went out to was they had to actually go out on a radioactive puddle in a parking lot. They got it there, but they have to go out on everything. They're a very secret, elite organization with special agents, engineers, scientific people. I mean, this is like an ultra secret type of group, NEST, even though it's publicized, but they're like an equivalent of a tier 1 operators, like SEALs and Delta and stuff like that, but they do that. But here's the interesting thing. So they had to go out on that New Jersey container that was broken into and that radioactive material had to go out. So their presence was there. And the thing is, they're very worried about that stuff being made into dirty bombs, whether it can or can't. But here's the thing that nobody knew that was happening right after all this drone stuff. And I'll show you because I got it on the FBI website. So the FBI was conducting that. They didn't tell anybody. And I talked to a state assemblyman in New York. He says, I have no idea what you're talking about. They did a large-scale nuclear training exercise in upstate New York for World War III. Now, I have never seen one happen. Nobody knew about this. They're saying, don't be alarmed, but they don't tell anybody. Wasn't put it on the news.
Wasn't
put on television.
All said, is well.
Hey, we are going to do this with nobody knowing, and we're getting ready for World War III. Serious. This is not a joke. This is actually on the
Chris,
Albany.
Do you remember when we were talking about the H-47 that was circling the nuke plant?
Yes.
Sure looks like it was part of this.
Yes. And that's what I'm saying is that they're not telling you what the real deal is.
All I can think of is Animal House when he's standing there. Remain calm.
Yeah. And so, because I wanted to find out what this drones were all about, because there was a person who builds drones I spoke to, and I can't give his name or anything. But when I asked him about this, he just stopped on the phone. He says, I'm not going to confirm or deny that. And I put it in a way where, I thought he'd give me an answer. But he says, no, and I was talking about were they looking for, a possible radioactive bomb or something like that. Now that makes sense of what Commander Coder's saying. Like, nothing to worry about, but it scared the hell out of me.
And what
But it's
exactly?
definitely not looking at nukes. Don't worry about that, but it scared the hell out of me.
Yeah.
What exactly is the strategic value of Schenectady?
No, in case a nuclear war breaks out, upstate has strategic areas. In the upstate areas, like there are certain places that are targeted for a nuclear missile from Russia or China, whatever. And I mean, Commander probably knows about this. I'm sure Don definitely knows about that. There are strategic areas that they're going to blow the smithereens out of. And so the FBI, along with NEST and some other organizations that probably have 3-letter initials to them, were on upstate New York doing a World War III mass casualty nuclear war.
It also might
scenario.
just be a convenient location to do it because you have enough urban and rural activity around it. You have airspace that allows you to do this, and you may be able to escape some of the public eye going on with it. So it wouldn't surprise me you pick a spot like that to do it. It does surprise me this time of year to do it.
Well, I'm encouraged by a couple of things that we have here. Let's remember that we're less than 2 weeks into a new administration. And I think it's encouraging that one of the first things that they do is they make an announcement about the drones. And then I don't know if you gentlemen saw any of Tulsi Gabbard's interview today. She is up for Director of National Intelligence. And in her opening remarks, she said that she is going to strive for transparency on a number of subjects. And she specifically mentioned UFO UAP.
Yes, I did hear it. And I think that's why she's being so fought with at such a vehement level that a lot of folks just do not like that.
Agreed. But it's encouraging, I think.
I think it is as well.
Ross Coulthard, he said a couple days ago on X, on a little clip he put up there, he said, if you would have asked me 2 years ago if the disclosure president would be Donald J. Trump, I would have thought you were on drugs. Here, it may well happen under this president. We'll see.
Well, his son is very interested in this. He had Lou Elizondo on his podcast, and he was dead serious. There was no joking around about it. And he says that he's going to talk to his father about it. So, there's got to be something there because...
Well, Donald Trump's the kind of a Mustang that just may say the hell with it and open his mouth.
I think a lot will be told when we see the condition of the files on the assassinations, the 3 assassinations that are going to be released. I think a lot will tell us where we're headed to. And I agree with you, Don. And I think that you're going to see the forces that have kept the lid on, that are convinced that we are not sophisticated enough like they are to know, fight him tooth and nail.
And one way they're going to do that is through malicious compliance. And here's what I mean by that. He put out this order eliminating in the military the DEI programs. And so what was the first thing that they publicized that they were going to get rid of? It is a course on the Tuskegee Airmen. Well, immediately the new defense secretary countermanded that and said, no, we're going to keep that particular thing. But they're going to look for ways to dam things up to prevent progress. And malicious compliance is a way to do that. You take something is going to be so outrageous and you overact to a government, an executive branch rule, and then you feed it to the press. And next thing you know, everybody's outraged about, oh no, what's going to happen with this? It's like the thing on.
You're spot on, Padre.
I'm sorry, slow down.
You're spot on.
Spot on. Okay.
What I would add to that is, I think that this particular administration, with the experience that they've had over the last 8 years, is playing a slightly different game this time.
Yes.
I think their ground game is completely different.
Mm-hmm.
I think their approach, and I watched this during the election because I was convinced that the election to count the votes was going to take multiple days. I prayed as hard as ever, regardless of what the outcome was. I prayed that we did not go multiple days, that we get back to some kind of a semblance of what an election in this country had been previously, that we knew, setting aside all the other intrigues and stuff going on. So
well, I'm sure you guys all remember the debacle with Al Gore and George Bush, the hanging chads and all that malarkey.
So it is a completely different game, and I said this in the first administration. I thought Trump in the first administration, given the opportunity, was one that was going to come clean or cleaner than any other president. Only because as an outsider, I just don't see him giving much of a toot on that. Now, given how everything is gone and with the perspective of experience, I think that that's there. Like I said, the assassination files, those being released, and the condition that we see that they're on there, I'm sure they'll honor the request of the King family so that they get first look at it, so they are prepared for what's there. Because I think there's some very sensitive things that are going to come forward on there, very sensational. We will be treated somewhat salaciously on the personal life of Martin Luther King. So I think that is due. I was very, very angry on the Tuskegee Airmen. I got to meet two of them. I think they are some of the most incredible aviators, considering what they were able to do. Just amazing men. And to play that game that way on something that precious, that important in our history, really aggravates me. And obviously, it got the ire of a lot of people going along and playing that game. I think that's what I'm saying about the team. The approach is much sharper. It's much crisper than it was the first time, and I think it's going to play to the favor of the country and the citizens of the country.
It does show you the depth of depravity that the people who want to block the things will go to try to gum up the works on this, though. But we have a president now who really, I don't want to say he doesn't care, but he doesn't have anything to lose. He's not going to run for a second term. He is very, his legacy is very important to him. And I see him as definitely wanting to be the president.
It's the third time I've heard that used. And I'm going to disagree with you, Padre, respectfully, as I did with the other two. I don't think President Trump really cares about his legacy. I think what he cares about more than anything else is the condition of this country and the restoration of this country to some kind of a semblance. He's referring to it as, returning to common sense that we once had. Yes, I think he has a huge ego. Yes, I think he presents himself that way. President Trump is President Trump. But I don't think he is driven by having the legacy etched on a mountain, because I guess we're still talking about him going on Mount Rushmore and all this other stuff. Great. I don't think he gives a hoot about that. I really don't. I think what he cares about, what is driving more than anything else, I think the assassination attempt a millimeter away from no longer being on this earth was a fundamental wake up for him. Maybe even in a biblical sense.
A go to Jesus moment, no pun intended.
Yeah, I agree, Don. I agree. So that's just my particular look at this. I think he really is driving and sees one thing and one thing only. This country has got to get itself right.
He's got no Washington insiders. All his picks are hard chargers, out of the beltway, loyal to him, going to do the right thing. Hedseth, Bondi, Kash Patel. I mean, they were trying to give Kash Patel a hard time today, and it was like water rolling over a duck's back. I mean, he could give. Yeah,
I'm still trying to figure out the great senator from Vermont and the onesie thing. That one, I have to admit,
Won't you denounce the onesie? You must denounce the onesie.
I honest to God, if there was like 100 things that you put up there and you put that one on there, I would have gone down the list and go, oh, no effing way. You got to be kidding me. No effing way would that ever come up in a congressional hearing for someone for Health and Human Services. You've got to be kidding. The onesie? And he wanted a commitment out of him, a commitment to know what his stance was on the onesie. Do you realize you're on the entire globe? There are people on cell phones in the darkest reaches of this globe looking at this, looking at a U.S. senator screaming at a man about an infant garment. Are you kidding me?
Well,
you guys want to know about disclosure? Well, I'll tell you what. You better have an answer next week about the onesie before we disclose what's going on with UAPs. That's it. That's my stance.
Well, I'll tell you this. Mount Rushmore is practically my backyard, and there's no way Donald Trump can go on it. There is not enough room on the mountain for his hair. Okay, it's just not going to fit. Not enough granite. Sorry.
Well, we can put an extension up there, Padre.
Are you
put him on a different mountain?
Is that what you're pointing out? A hair extension? Donald Trump's hair is real. I have it on good authority because I heard it from somebody that heard it from a Secret Service agent that his hair is real.
Well, I will tell you this. If anybody, and I truly believe this, and I agree with what Commander said, if anybody is going to disclose this, it's going to be Donald Trump. And I think it's just going to be like somebody says, no, you can't do this and stuff. He's going to say, screw you. And the next day he's going to walk out in the Rose Garden and say, yeah, they're here. Here's the information. I mean, when people challenge him, that's when he digs in. You know, he's a counterpuncher.
He gets hardcore. He does.
Yeah.
Well, as we're hitting the closing, I just want to say, Don, thanks for putting together a great show tonight. You guys were wonderful. Robert was absolutely stupendous. It was a real honor to be on the show with him and you gentlemen tonight. Thank you.
And I just want to say thank you, Commander, for giving us that insight on what happened with the crash. I know that was probably hard for you to deal with that, but I appreciate what you did.
Crash course in avionics. You bet, Commander. Okay, gentlemen, we are unfortunately out of time. I hope everybody has a great evening, what's left of it. And good Lord willing, the river don't rise. We'll be back next week. Good night, everybody.